"Let me marry her first, just to secure the alliance," the Alpha stated, his voice echoing through the cavernous, frost-chilled council chamber. He did not yell. He did not need to. The sheer, casual arrogance of his tone cut through the heavy silence like a serrated blade, bleeding out every ounce of warmth left in the room. Ayla Ashwood kept her head bowed. The rough, untreated fabric of her simple woolen dress scratched against her collarbone, a stark reminder of her place in this grand stone hall. For years, she had believed that the moon goddess did not care about silk or gold. She had believed that the sacred, ancient fated mate bond was absolute and unbreakable. She was wrong. Instead, it became the moment Ayla Ashwood's entire world shattered. The crescent-claiming mark on her left wrist, a brand that had once pulsed with the molten gold heat of a summer sun, now throbbed with a sickening, freezing ache. It felt as though a jagged shard of ice had been driven directly into her veins, slowly crystallizing her blood. Alpha Liam Vance stood before the grand hearth, his massive, intimidating frame blocking the firelight. He possessed storm, grey eyes that usually projected fierce protection and unwavering devotion. Today, those eyes were flat, transactional, and entirely devoid of the man she thought she knew. Beside him stood the reason for the freezing void opening up inside Ella's chest. Clara Danvers, the calculating, proud heiress of the wealthiest bloodline in the Northern Territories. Clara was draped in exquisite crimson gowns that spilled over the cold granite floor like fresh blood. Her scent, a cloying, heavy wave of sweet gardenia, permeated the room, though Ayla's heightened senses caught the faint, unmistakable, underlying stench of moral rot. Clara desired the title of Luna above all things, and she had used her family's vast economic leverage to corner the Alpha, forcing him to make a choice between his heart and his crown. "It is merely a political necessity, Ayla," Liam continued, his tone shifting to a patronizing murmur as he finally looked down at her. "The Thornwood Pack is starving. The winter has decimated our borders. Clara brings the resources, the grain, the steel we need to survive the decade. I must wed her in the light, but you are my fated mate." He spoke the words as if they were a grand concession, a generous gift bestowed upon a beggar. Ella remained perfectly still. The hollow mark doesn't just contain your power, it creates a void, an absence where your magic should be. Right now, that massive aching void was swallowing her completely. She felt the heavy stares of the pack elders pressing down on her shoulders. They looked at her with pity, with disgust, with deep impatience. To them, she was a quiet, low-status Omega, a girl who scrubbed the floors and brewed the healing poultices. A girl who had stitched Liam's chest together with her own hands after the border skirmishes, bleeding her own elemental warmth into his veins just to keep his heart beating. "You will remain here," Liam ordered, stepping closer. The scent of pine and leather, an aroma that had once been Ayla's ultimate sanctuary, now made her stomach turn with visceral nausea. "You will be kept safe in the Eastern Wing. When the political dust settles, I will claim you in secret. You will have my protection, my care, and my loyalty. But Clara will wear the crown." To punctuate his command, Liam reached into the pocket of his dark velvet coat. He withdrew an object and tossed it casually onto the floor between them. The sound of it hitting the ancient stone floor was a sharp, pathetic clatter. It was a rusted iron ring, an oxidized, cheap band of base metal. It rolled unevenly across the uneven granite blocks before coming to a stop just inches from Ayla's worn leather boots. This was his offering, a rusted shackle meant to bind her in the shadows, while he stood in the blinding light of the high altar with another woman. It was a proposition of supreme insult, reducing the sacred, cosmic design of the moon goddess to a dirty, transactional secret. "Take it," the Alpha said, his voice dropping into a low, commanding timbre that vibrated against the stone walls. It was a tone meant to force submission, a frequency that compelled lesser wolves to drop to their knees and bare their throats. "Wear it. Let me marry her first, and I swear to you, Ayla, I will make it up to you. Clara offered a sweet, practiced smile, stepping forward to loop her delicate arm through Liam's. "It is a very generous arrangement," the heiress purred, her voice dripping with venomous satisfaction. "Not many leaders would go to such lengths to keep a low-status worker comfortable. You should count your blessings, girl. You will be well fed, and you will never have to worry about the cold again." Oella stared at the rusted ring. The metal was pitted, flaking with orange decay. It was exactly like Liam's promise, corrupt, deteriorating, and entirely worthless. The physical feedback of the severed bond raged inside her. Her wrist felt as though it were being held to an open flame, while her core temperature plummeted into a glacial freeze. She could feel the exact moment the ancestral magic inside her, a deep, dormant power she had hidden all her life to survive, curled back in absolute revulsion. The pack elders began to murmur, their voices a rising tide of collective agreement. "The boy is too kind," an elder whispered loudly from the shadows of the arched columns. "She brings no dowry, no alliances, no royal blood. She is an orphan of the woods. She should be weeping with gratitude that he did not banish her outright. An iron ring is more than a defective Omega deserves." Another scoffed, the sound echoing harshly off the vaulted ceiling. Ayla absorbed their cruel words without flinching. The somatic toll of the insult manifested in a sharp, tearing sensation behind her ribs. The fated mate bond was not merely a psychological connection. It was a physical, cellular tether designed by the gods. When a male rejected his mate, the bond snapped clean. But what Liam was doing was far worse. He was stretching the tether, twisting it, trying to force it into a suffocating cage of his own design. He was actively poisoning the very magic that connected their souls. Her breath plumed in the freezing air of the chamber. She looked from the cheap metal on the floor to the polished, gleaming gold bands adorning Clara's fingers. The contrast was a physical blow, a stark visual representation of her exact worth in Liam Vance's eyes. She was a dirty, hidden secret. Clara was the prized public triumph. "Well?" Liam demanded, his patience fracturing. He expected tears. He expected her to drop to her knees, to weep, to beg for a better arrangement, or to eagerly snatch up the iron ring and pledge her undying, pathetic loyalty. He thrived on the devotion of others, feeding on the absolute control he wielded over his people. But Ayla Ashwood did not weep. She did not drop to her knees. She did not even tremble. Instead of the dramatic, theatrical display of heartbreak the Alpha had prepared himself to witness, Ayla met his gaze with an expression of profound, terrifying emptiness. The chaotic, agonizing storm of somatic pain in her chest suddenly quieted, freezing over into a solid, impenetrable block of glacial ice. She looked at the man she had loved. She looked at the broad shoulders she'd had helped bear the weight of leadership. She looked at the mouth that had once whispered desperate, fated promises into her hair during the darkest, coldest nights of their youth. And she realized, with a devastating clarity that knocked the breath from her lungs, that the boy she had bled for was dead. The man standing before her was a stranger wearing his face, a creature built of political greed and cowardly compromises. A girl who has never been seen cannot be replaced, because she was never there to begin with, Ayla thought, the realization settling heavily into her bones. Liam had never truly seen her. He had only seen what her devotion could do for him. He had seen a loyal, quiet servant who would absorb his pain, heal his wounds, and ask for nothing in return. He assumed her silence was weakness. He assumed her low status meant she possessed no pride. Ayla slowly lifted her chin. The flickering light of the hearth caught the silver determination in her eyes, a sudden, sharp flash of dormant sovereignty that made Liam take a heavy, involuntary half-step backward. "I respectfully decline your generous offer, Alpha Liam," Ayla said. Her voice was not a whisper, nor was it a scream. It was level, perfectly modulated, and as cold as the frost clinging to the window panes. Liam blinked, the arrogant sneer slipping from his face, replaced by a deep, furrowed confusion. "What did you say?" "I will not be your shadow," Ayla continued, her words ringing out in the cavernous room, silencing the whispering elders instantly. "I will not wear your rust. I will not sit in a dark room and wait for the scraps of a man who traded his soul for grain and steel. If you choose to marry Clara Danvers, you do so without me." "Ah, la." "Be reasonable," Liam growled, a flicker of genuine panic bleeding into his tone as he realized she was not playing the role he had assigned her. He stepped forward, reaching out a large hand to grasp her shoulder. "You have nowhere to go. The winter beyond the borders is a death sentence. You cannot survive without my protection." She stepped back, evading his touch with a fluid, graceful motion that left his hand grasping at empty air. "Then I will die in the snow," she replied flatly. "But I will die as a free woman, not as a caged secret." She did not wait for his permission to leave. She did not bow. She turned her back on the leader of the Thornwood pack, turned her back on the sneering rival, draped in crimson, and walked toward the heavy oak doors of the chamber. "Aila!" Liam roared, his alpha command lashing out like a physical whip. It was a sound that forced the elders to whimper and cover their ears, a sonic wave of pure dominance designed to crush disobedience. Aela felt the command strike her spine, a heavy, suffocating pressure trying to force her to her knees. But the broken, severed edges of their mate bond acted as a shield. His power had no purchase on her soul anymore. She pushed through the heavy doors and stepped out into the freezing, dimly lit corridors of the pack house, leaving the rusted iron ring completely untouched on the cold granite floor behind her. The walk to her quarters was a blur of sensory dissociation. Her pulse pounded a frantic, erratic rhythm against her eardrums. The stone walls of the fortress seemed to close in around her, suffocating and damp. Every step she took away from Liam stretched the invisible, cellular tether of their bond to its absolute limit, the psychic friction generating a searing heat across her skin before snapping back into agonizing, numb cold. She reached her small, drafty room in the servants' wing. It was a miserable, barren space containing only a narrow cot, a cracked wash basin, and a single flickering tallow candle. For years, she had endured this squalor, because she believed they were building a future together. She had embraced the smallness of her life, trusting the grand fated design of the moon goddess. Moving with a mechanical, brutal efficiency, Aela pulled her single battered leather suitcase from beneath the cot. She did not own much. She did not need much. She packed 2 rough woolen tunics, a pair of thick stockings, a small bundle of dried healing herbs, and a wooden comb her mother had carved for her before she died. She did not pack the silver locket Liam had given her on her 18th birthday. She left it sitting on the cracked wash basin, its chain tangled and dull. There were no tears. The betrayal was too absolute, the insult too profound for weeping. Crying was for those who still held out hope for a different outcome, for those who believed an apology could mend the fracture. Aela knew the truth. Some things, once shattered, could never be put back together. She snapped the rusty brass latches of the suitcase shut. The metallic click echoed in the tiny room, a final, definitive punctuation mark on her life in this territory. Before she opened the door to the courtyard, Aela pulled back the rough sleeve of her tunic to look at her left wrist. The claiming mark, which had defined her entire existence for the past 3 years, was actively dying. The rich, luminescent gold had faded into a sickly, bruised purple, the edges flaking away like dead skin. The physical pain was excruciating, a constant, rhythmic throbbing that mirrored the beating of a dying heart. It was a somatic manifestation of Liam's betrayal, a literal rotting of their spiritual connection. Aela traced the fading mark with a trembling, collused finger. She knew that by tomorrow it would be nothing more than a hollow, pale scar. She welcomed the scar. A scar meant the wound had closed. A scar meant the bleeding had stopped. She pulled her heavy woolen cloak over her shoulders and raised the hood to shield her face. Opening the heavy wooden door, she was instantly hit by the brutal, howling fury of the winter storm. The wind screamed through the stone archways, carrying biting shards of ice that stung her cheeks and lashed at her eyes. The world outside was a swirling, chaotic vortex of white and grey, a deadly, freezing wilderness that claimed the lives of seasoned warriors every year. Aela did not hesitate. She gripped the handle of her suitcase, her knuckles turning white from the cold, and stepped out into the blizzard. The snow immediately began to swallow her footprints, erasing any evidence that she had ever existed within these walls. The biting cold numbed her skin, her fingers, her face, but it could not touch the frozen wasteland spreading through her chest. She did not look back at the towering, dark spires of the packhouse. She did not pause to listen for her former mate's voice on the wind. She simply walked forward, leaning into the fierce gale, putting one foot in front of the other as she headed toward the neutral borders. She was walking into the deadly unknown, possessing nothing but the clothes on her back and the absolute, unyielding certainty of her own worth. The road north was treacherous in the dead of winter, but Aela Ashwood did not care. She walked through knee-deep snow until her legs burned with a fierce lactic ache. The blizzard was a physical wall of absolute hostility, a swirling vortex of blinding white that sought to bury her beneath its freezing drifts. Every single step she took away from the packhouse stretched the invisible, cellular tether of her dying, fated bond to its absolute limit. The psychic friction generated a searing, agonizing heat across her skin. It was a phantom fire that offered no warmth against the blizzard, delivering only the sickening sensation of a deeply damaged connection. She dragged her tired body forward, her knuckles bruised inside her thin woolen gloves. The biting wind screamed across the frozen valley, yet the brutal external environment was nothing compared to the devastation inside her chest. The crescent claiming mark on her left wrist, once a brilliant symbol of cosmic destiny, was actively fading. The bruised purple edges had turned hollow in the freezing cold, flaking away into a dull, ashen grey. With every mile she conquered, the magic weakened against the profound insult of Liam Vance and his rusted iron ring. She refused to let the Wildlands claim her just because an arrogant alpha had deemed her unworthy of standing in his light, choosing instead to secure his political future with Clara Danvers. Hours bled into an indeterminate, agonizing stretch of darkness. The storm showed absolutely no signs of breaking, but Aela could feel the ancient, thrumming resonance of the neutral borders calling to her blood. It was a subtle vibration in the frozen earth, a low, tectonic hum that whispered of unconditional sanctuary. By the time the tree line finally broke, her physical form was operating on the very last fumes of her adrenaline. Rising from the jagged, snow-swept cliffs ahead was the grand temple of the moon goddess. It was a staggering architectural marvel, carved directly into the sheer obsidian face of the mountain. The sanctuary was neutral ground, a sacred territory where no alpha could claim jurisdiction. Supervised by Priest Oris and the temple elders, it was the only place left in the world where an exiled, broken Omega could seek a quiet refuge, but the imposing structure was still so far away. A grand staircase of slick, ice-coated granite separated her from the towering iron doors of the sanctuary. Aela stumbled at the base of the massive steps, her knees buckling as a sudden, violent spasm ripped through her chest. The tether stretched to a microscopic, agonizing thread. It did not fully snap, but the visceral, physical strain echoed through the hollow caverns of her soul. Aela gasped, dropping to the ground as she fell forward, catching herself on the freezing stone steps with her bare hands. A sharp, metallic taste flooded her mouth, the sheer physical toll of the dying bond leaving her completely drained. The fated mate connection thrummed with cold poison, barely attached, worn down by distance, betrayal, and the toxic compromise Liam Vance had tried to force upon her. The agonizing throbbing in her wrist spiked into a cavernous, terrifying numbness, a brutal warning of the permanent rupture to come. She was nearly untethered now, a solitary soul teetering on the brink of a brutal world. The fading of his lingering psychic presence left a gaping, freezing void behind her ribs. Ayala squeezed her eyes shut, fighting back the wave of dizzying nausea. We are small things in a world of teeth, she reminded herself, clutching the icy stone of the grand staircase. Smallness is a gift. Use it. She had survived years of being the invisible, calloused hands that stitched the pack together in the shadows while her worth was ignored. She would survive this immense emptiness, too. She forced herself upright, her breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps. Leaving the freezing valley behind, Ayala began to climb the grand staircase. The wind tried desperately to tear her from the side of the mountain, but she anchored her numb fingers into the deep crevices of the ancient granite, dragging her exhausted body upward inch by painful inch. When she finally reached the vast, sweeping landing before the temple, her vision was beginning to grey at the edges. The towering iron doors of the sanctuary stood closed, heavily embossed with the celestial phases of the moon and ancient runes of protection. Ayala staggered toward the massive gates, her legs feeling like blocks of solid lead, her heartbeat slowing to a dangerous, sluggish rhythm. She raised her trembling, frost-bitten fist to strike the heavy iron, praying that the venerable priests within would hear a single, desperate knock over the roaring gale. But before her knuckles could even make contact with the frozen metal, a deep, resonating mechanical groan echoed from within the thick stone walls. The massive iron doors shuddered, their heavy hinges protesting loudly as they slowly swung inward. Instantly, a blinding, incandescent golden light spilled out from the sanctuary, cutting through the snowy darkness like a divine blade. Ayala flinched, instinctively raising her arm to shield her eyes from the sudden brilliance. The warmth that poured from the open threshold was not the smoky, suffocating heat of a packhouse hearth. It was clean, radiant, and intensely pure. It carried the rich, intoxicating scent of sun-warmed amber, crushed cedarwood, and the sharp, crackling ozone of a summer lightning storm. Framed in the towering archway stood a man who seemed to have been forged by the storm itself. Gerald Sterling, the Lycan king of the sovereign territory, commanded a physical presence that defied mortal comprehension. He was massive, his incredibly broad shoulders easily filling the space between the heavy iron doors. Clad in dark obsidian battle armor, draped with thick, silver-tipped pelts, he radiated an aura of absolute, unquestionable dominance. But it was his eyes that stole the breath straight from Ayala's burning lungs. They were a piercing, vibrant shade of molten gold, glowing with an ancient, predatory intelligence that immediately pinned her exactly where she stood. Ayala froze, her deeply ingrained survival instincts screaming at her to submit. She was a broken outcast, standing before the most feared apex predator in 3 continents. The sovereign was a living legend, a ruthless conqueror who ruled a massive empire to the east. He was not a man who entertained the weak, nor was he a leader who accepted political compromises. He was a king who commanded entire armies with a single, quiet word. Yet, as the monarch's burning gaze swept over her shivering form, the terrifying, oppressive weight of his alpha aura did not crush her. Instead, the atmospheric pressure around them radically shifted, transforming the deadly blizzard into a heavy, enveloping blanket of absolute, uncompromising protection. Gerald did not see a defective Omega standing on the temple steps. His heightened, ancient Lycan senses cut straight through the overwhelming scent of wet wool, freezing snow, and hollow betrayal. He smelled the dormant, heavily suppressed magic singing quietly beneath Ayala's freezing skin. He recognized the rare, undeniable signature of her supreme celestial lineage, a divine, sovereign bloodline that had been thought permanently lost for centuries. And beneath that majestic sacred scent, he smelled the sharp, tragic essence of a brutally damaged mate bond on the verge of collapsing. The Lycan king stepped out into the raging blizzard, entirely immune to the biting wind. He moved with a terrifying, liquid grace, closing the distance between them before the exhausted woman could even register the the shift in his aggressive stance. He stopped mere inches from her, his towering frame completely blocking the fury of the storm, sheltering her perfectly in his massive, warm shadow. Aella tipped her chin up, stubbornly refusing to cower. Even violently shivering, even reeling from the cellular shock of her failing tether, she kept her spine perfectly straight. She met the sovereign's molten gold eyes with her own defiant silver gaze. She would not beg him for entry into the temple. She had just walked away from one arrogant ruler. She would absolutely not crawl in the snow for another. Gerald stared down at her, the hard, lethal lines of his aristocratic face suddenly softening into an expression of profound, shaking reverence. He looked at the bruised, ashen skin of her left wrist, where the withered crescent mark was still faintly visible against her pale flesh. His golden eyes darkened, with a terrifying surge of protective fury as he realized the exact depth of the crime that had been committed against her. He saw a magnificent woman who had been handed a rusted, insulting shackle by Liam, and had chosen to walk into a deadly blizzard, rather than compromise the sanctity of her own soul. Because when I saw you lying there, broken and abandoned, something in me roared that I had to save you, even if saving you destroys me, Gerald thought. The ancient, feral instincts of his lichen beast surged violently against his ribs. The beast did not want to conquer the defiant woman standing in the snow. The massive, terrifying beast wanted to drop to its knees and press its throat to her frozen boots in total, absolute surrender. Without a single word of patronizing pity, the Lichen King reached up and unclasped the heavy, silver-tipped fur mantle from his own armored shoulders. The movement was slow, deliberate, projecting an intense gentleness that stood in stark contrast to his lethal, bloody reputation. He draped the incredibly warm cloak over Aella's trembling shoulders. The thick pelts instantly trapped her fading body heat, enveloping her entirely in his intoxicating, grounding scent of amber and cedar. "You are freezing," Gerald murmured. His voice was a deep, gravelly rumble that vibrated pleasantly against her sternum. It did not carry the sharp, demanding crack of an alpha's command. It was a low, soothing vibration, a frequency entirely designed to comfort, to ground, and to heal.
"I am seeking asylum,"
Aella managed to say, her voice cracking painfully from the cold. She instinctively pulled the heavy fur tighter around her throat, the sudden influx of rich warmth making her exhausted head spin. The neutral laws state that the High Temple must grant sanctuary to any wolf who claims it. The temple offers nothing but hard stone floors and cold prayers. Gerald replied softly, his burning golden eyes locked onto hers, with an unwavering, intense focus. "You require far more than an empty sanctuary, little wolf. You require a kingdom that recognizes exactly what you truly are." Aella blinked, the intense physical exhaustion finally beginning to erode the high walls of her emotional defenses. "I am nothing," she whispered, the cruelty of the Thornwood elders echoing bitterly in her mind. "I am a discarded Omega. I have no pack, no status, and no magic. The man who claimed me just tossed me aside for a dowry of grain and steel." A dark, terrifying shadow passed over the Lichen King's face at her heartbreaking admission. The air around them crackled with sudden, volatile static. The sheer, overwhelming force of his suppressed fury caused the falling snow to instantly vaporize into steam before it could even hit his black armor. The ancient beast inside him raged violently at the thought of another male daring to dismiss the majestic, divine creature standing before him. "The man who claimed you is a blind, arrogant fool who has just signed his own death warrant," Gerald stated, his tone dropping into a deadly, chilling register that promised absolute ruin. He slowly reached out, his large, calloused fingers gently wrapping around her frozen, bruised left wrist. He did not touch the dying mark directly, but his sheer proximity alone sent a massive wave of soothing, molten warmth, surging straight into her freezing veins. He looked at a goddess and saw a servant. He looked at the sun and complained about the glare. Aella's breath caught sharply in her throat. The hollow, agonizing void in her chest suddenly twitched. It was a microscopic spark, a tiny, vibrating flutter of absolute recognition deep within her cellular structure. The dormant ancient magic, which had spent years hiding in quiet terror from her former mate's oppressive control, began to eagerly uncoil. It reached desperately toward the radiant, fiercely protective heat of the Lycan King. "I am Gerald Sterling," the monarch continued, his large thumb gently brushing the delicate pulse point on her freezing wrist. The physical touch was incredibly respectful, offering immense comfort without demanding an ounce of possession. "And I did not come to this high temple tonight to pray. I came because the ancient resonance of the earth woke me from my sleep. It told me that my crown was wandering through the snow, alone and freezing." Ayla stared at the massive warrior, her heart suddenly hammering a frantic, wild rhythm against her ribs. The sheer magnitude of his words was far too massive to easily comprehend. "Your crown? You are not a dirty secret meant for the shadows, Ayla Ashwood," Gerald declared, his rich voice carrying the absolute, unyielding certainty of divine law. He did not ask how she knew his name, nor did he explain how he knew hers. The fates had already inscribed her identity permanently onto his soul. "You are not a secondary choice. You are the supreme design." The Lycan King took a slow, deliberate step backward, the heavy snow swirling violently around his dark, imposing armor, and then, to the absolute, staggering shock of the temple guards standing in the distant courtyard, the most powerful sovereign in the known world lowered his massive frame. He bent his knee upon the ice, bringing himself down until he was looking reverently up at the shivering, exhausted woman wrapped in his royal cloak. "I offer you sanctuary, not as a beggar, but as my unquestioned equal," Gerald said, his golden eyes blazing with fierce, unwavering devotion. He held out his large, bare hand toward her, the gesture completely devoid of coercion. "I do not offer you a rusted iron ring of compromise. I offer you the protection of my armies, the vast wealth of my empire, and the unbreakable loyalty of my soul. Marry me, Ayla. Walk into this temple with me, and let us unite our bloodlines before the goddess tonight." Ayla looked down at the kneeling sovereign. The stark contrast was incredibly staggering. Just a few hours ago, she had been humiliated, ordered to hide in a drafty, miserable servant's wing, while Liam traded her inherent worth for political convenience. Now, the apex predator of the realms was kneeling in the freezing snow, offering her the entire world without demanding a single degrading concession. He was asking for her consent. He was completely yielding his immense, terrifying power to her choice. "Thank you for letting me go," Ayla thought, a sudden blinding clarity washing away the very last remnants of her cold grief. Because being let go had allowed her to be found by a better man, a better kingdom, a better life, and she would never, ever look back. She reached out from beneath the heavy, silver-tipped fur mantle. Her slender fingers, still faintly trembling from the winter frost, found the king's outstretched hand. The exact moment their skin made contact, a violent, euphoric shockwave of pure, blinding energy blasted through the frozen temple courtyard. The dying, bruised mark on her left wrist flared with sudden, intense heat. The withered grey tissue of her old bond was instantly pushed back, overshadowed as a new, brilliant crest of molten gold began to burn itself into her skin, preparing for the formal rites that would sever her past permanently. It was not a tether of restriction or a shackle of compromise. It was a radiant promise of a crown of crimson and gold. "Yes," Ayla whispered, her voice steady, clear and ringing with newfound sovereignty over the howling wind. "I accept." The massive iron doors of the grand temple groaned shut, cutting off the violent, howling scream of the blizzard. The sudden silence that filled the sanctuary was absolute, heavy and deeply reverent. Ayla stood just inside the threshold, the thick silver-tipped fur mantle pooling around her boots. The freezing numbness that had threatened to stop her heart only moments ago was already retreating, chased away by the ambient, divine warmth radiating from the ancient stone walls. But the true source of her newfound heat was not the temple hearths. It was the towering king standing beside her, his massive presence anchoring her to the physical world. Priest Oris emerged from the shadowed colonnades of the eastern wing, his long, sweeping white robes brushing silently against the polished obsidian floor. He was a venerable figure, his faces lined with decades of impartial devotion to the moon goddess. He carried a silver staff topped with a glowing pale moonstone. As he approached, his ancient, milky eyes did not initially focus on the terrifying sovereign. Instead, the priest's gaze locked directly onto the shivering, exhausted woman wrapped in the royal cloak. Oris stopped, leaning heavily on his staff, and let out a long, trembling breath. He could sense the microscopic, dying thread of her old, corrupted mate bond, but far more intensely, he felt the blinding, dormant resonance of her celestial lineage beginning to awaken. The ancient text spoke of a wandering star, Oris murmured, his voice a dry, echoing rasp that commanded immediate respect. He bowed his head, a gesture of profound honor, rarely bestowed upon a lone Omega. I did not expect to live long enough to see the prophecy walk through my doors. You have suffered a grievous spiritual wound, child. The tether of your past was poisoned by a coward's compromise. The past is severed, Gerald stated, his rich, commanding voice echoing through the vast chamber. He did not step away from Ayla, maintaining a close, protective proximity that kept her core temperature steadily rising. She is Ayla Ashwood, and she is not here to seek a quiet corner to heal in the shadows. I claim her as my equal. We require the rites of the high marriage, Oris, tonight. The venerable priest slowly raised his head, his milky eyes shifting to the king. He did not argue. He did not question the haste. The sheer, indisputable reality of the molten gold bond crest currently forming on Ayaza's left wrist was all the proof the ancient laws required. It was a fated alignment of supreme power, a cosmic correction to a terrible injustice. The goddess does not delay when destiny finally writes itself. The old man agreed solemnly. The high altar will be prepared, but first the bride must shed the garments of her exile. She must be cleansed of the dirt and the sorrow of the pack that failed her. Oris gestured with his silver staff, and a silent procession of temple handmaidens stepped out from the alcoves. They approached Ayla with deep, quiet reverence, bowing low before gently ushering her toward the inner sanctums of the temple. Ayla glanced back at Gerald, a sudden, irrational spike of panic fluttering in her chest at the thought of leaving his protective aura. The king caught her gaze instantly. He did not offer a patronizing smile or tell her not to be afraid. He simply nodded, his molten gold eyes promising that he would tear the temple down stone by stone if any harm came to her. Reassured by the absolute certainty of his silent vow, she followed the handmaidens into the warm, fragrant depths of the sanctuary. The preparation chambers were a stark contrast to the miserable, drafty servants' quarters Ayla had occupied in the Thornwood packhouse. Here the air was thick with the intoxicating, heady scent of crushed lotus, burning sandalwood, and warm jasmine. The handmaidens led her to a sunken marble bathing pool filled with steaming, mineral-rich water. As she removed her rough, wet woolen tunic and the threadbare stockings that had failed to protect her from the snow, Ayla felt the physical weight of her previous life finally slipping away. She stepped into the scalding, fragrant water, letting the heat sink deep into her aching, overtaxed muscles. The physical contrast was immediate and profound. As the thick steam wrapped around her shivering frame, the tiny, stubborn crystals of ice finally melted from her eyelashes, marking the true thawing of her frozen state. For the first time in her life, she was not the one pouring the water, scrubbing the floors, or tending to the wounds of ungrateful warriors. She was the one being served. The handmaidens moved with graceful, practiced efficiency, washing the freezing grime of the blizzard from her skin. They massaged rare, expensive oils into her scalp, detangling her long, damp hair until it shone with a healthy, vibrant luster. As the physical dirt was washed away, The somatic trauma of Liam's betrayal began to genuinely detach from her soul. The agonizing, bruising ache in her chest, the tearing sensation behind her ribs. It was all dissolving into the steaming water, leaving behind a clean, empty canvas. When she finally emerged from the bath, her skin was flushed, glowing with a renewed, vital energy. The handmaidens wrapped her in soft, heated linen towels before presenting the ceremonial garments. Oris had ordered the temple vaults opened, retrieving the sacred, ancestral wedding attire reserved only for the highest, most divine unions. They did not hand her a simple white dress of an ordinary bride. They brought forth royal crimson and gold silks. The fabric was impossibly heavy, woven from threads of pure spun gold, and dyed in a shade of crimson so deep it mirrored the heart of a burning star. As the handmaidens carefully draped the silks over her shoulders, Aela felt the immediate, grounding weight of the ancient material. The dress clung to her curves with an elegant, sovereign grace. The intricate golden embroidery depicting celestial phases of the moon and the fierce, protective arcs of the sun. It was not a garment meant to hide her. It was armor forged of beauty and undeniable authority. Aela stood before a massive, polished silver mirror positioned at the end of the chamber. She stared at her own reflection, her breath catching softly in her throat. The exhausted, invisible Omega, who had scrubbed the granite floors of the Thornwood Council Chamber, was completely gone. The girl who had stared at a rusted iron ring in quiet despair had been entirely erased. Staring back at her was a queen. Her silver eyes, once downcast and guarded, now held the sharp, piercing clarity of a woman who knew exactly what she was worth. The crimson silk highlighted the newfound, healthy flush in her cheeks, and the gold threading seemed to catch and amplify the dormant magical resonance humming beneath her skin. She lifted her left arm, pushing back the heavy, flowing sleeve of the silk gown to inspect her wrist. The old crescent claiming mark, the brand that had once tied her to Liam Vance, was completely dead. It had faded into a pale, barely visible silver scar, completely devoid of pain, heat, or connection. In its place, sitting just above her pulse point, was the new molten gold bond crest. It was not fully sealed yet, but it pulsed with a warm, steady, rhythmic heartbeat. It was a comforting, radiant heat, a physical manifestation of Gerald's absolute loyalty and protective devotion. Priest Oris entered the preparation chamber, his footsteps silent on the marble floor. He held a magnificent scarlet and gilded diadem, a heavy ancient headpiece set with brilliant sunburst fire rubies. The jewels caught the flickering candlelight, throwing fractured, dancing beams of scarlet and gold across the stone walls. It has been 300 years since a bride possessed the strength to wear this celestial crown, the old priest noted, his voice trembling slightly with awe. He approached Aela, stopping just behind her to look at her reflection in the silver mirror. The man you left behind offered you a rusted shackle. The king offers you the weight of an empire. Are you prepared to bear it, Aela Ashwood? Aela did not hesitate. The lingering shadows of doubt, the small, insidious voices of the Thornwood elders that had plagued her mind for years, were utterly silenced by the steady, molten warmth pulsing at her wrist. She turned to face the venerable priest, her spine perfectly straight, her chin lifted in a posture of unquestionable nobility. "I am prepared," she stated, her voice resonating with a calm, unshakable certainty. Oris smiled, a rare, genuine expression of joy cracking the severe lines of his weathered face. He raised the heavy, jewel-encrusted headpiece, bringing it down to rest perfectly upon her head. The moment the cold metal touched her skin, a sudden, thrilling shock of elemental energy surged down her spine. The fire rubies seemed to ignite, glowing with an inner incandescent light that matched the fierce determination in her silver eyes. "Then let us proceed," the priest declared, tapping his silver staff against the marble floor. "The altar awaits, and your king is not a patient man when it comes to claiming his true destiny." The grand hallway leading to the high altar was a cavernous, awe-inspiring architectural marvel. lined with towering pillars of polished black obsidian and illuminated by thousands of floating enchanted candles. As Aela walked out of the preparation chambers, the heavy crimson and gold silks trailing majestically behind her, the atmosphere inside the neutral temple shifted dramatically. The low, rhythmic chanting of the temple monks echoed through the vaulted ceilings, a deeply resonant, ancient hymn that vibrated through the stone floor and straight into the marrow of her bones. The air was thick with the sacred, intoxicating smoke of burning myrrh and frankincense, a sensory blanket that wrapped around her, heightening every single nerve ending in her body. At the far end of the vast sanctuary, standing before the towering crescent-shaped altar of the moon goddess, waited Gerald Sterling. The king had shed his thick, silver-tipped pelts and heavy obsidian battle armor. He was dressed in formal, impeccable royal attire, a sharply tailored coat of deep, midnight blue velvet, accented with intricate silver thread that mirrored the night sky. Without the bulky armor, the sheer, terrifying magnitude of his physical strength was even more pronounced. He stood with the absolute, uncompromising stillness of an apex predator, his broad shoulders squared, his hands resting loosely at his sides. But it was his face that arrested Aela's entire focus. The hard, lethal lines of his jaw were set in intense concentration, and his piercing, molten gold eyes were locked onto her with a hunger and reverence so profound it made the air between them literally shimmer with heat. No woman lasted a night with him. They had whispered in the dark corners of the Thornwood servant's wing. The rumors painted him as a bloodthirsty monster, a ruthless sovereign who conquered kingdoms and left nothing but ash in his wake. But one woman did. One woman lasted a lifetime. Aela looked at the man waiting for her, and she realized the rumors were built by cowards who could not comprehend his power. Because monsters do not look at me the way you do, she thought, her heart swelling with an overwhelming, fearless surge of affection. He looked at her not as a prize to be won, nor as a political asset to be traded, but as the literal center of his entire universe. As she walked slowly down the long, candle-lit aisle, the physical tracking of their fated mate bond intensified exponentially. With every step she took toward him, the golden crest on her wrist throbbed harder, the heat escalating from a comforting warmth to a searing, euphoric blaze. It did not hurt. It was the exact opposite of the freezing, agonizing decay she had suffered under Liam's rejection. This heat was restorative, actively rushing into the hollow, empty voids of her soul and filling them with liquid sunlight. Gerald's own chest rose and fell in a heavy, ragged rhythm, his lichen beast fighting a desperate, visceral battle for control as his mate drew closer, his hands curled into tight fists, his knuckles turning white as he visibly restrained himself from crossing the aisle and dragging her into his arms before the rites were finished. She reached the base of the high altar, stopping just one step below him. Priest Oris took his position behind the sacred stone, raising his glowing moonstone staff high above their heads. The chanting of the monks swelled into a powerful, deafening crescendo, shaking the dust from the ancient rafters. Before Gerald could reach out to take her hands, a massive, deafening crash echoed through the sanctuary. The heavy iron doors at the temple's entrance were thrown violently open, slamming against the stone walls and letting in a howling rush of freezing winter wind. Aela turned, her crimson silk swirling around her ankles. Standing perfectly framed in the grand archway, breathing raggedly and coated in fresh snow, was Alpha Liam Vance, clinging to his arm, shivering in a luxurious but entirely inadequate white gown, was Clara Danvers. They had arrived for their own politically arranged marriage ceremony, expecting to find an empty altar and a compliant priest. Instead, Liam froze, his arrogant posture dissolving instantly as his eyes locked onto the high altar. The sight before him defied all comprehension. There stood Aela, the quiet, discarded Omega he had commanded to wait in the shadows for a rusted iron ring. But she was not broken. She was standing tall, draped in royal crimson and gold, the legendary crown of crimson gold resting upon her brow, and beside her, shielding her with terrifying absolute devotion, was Gerald Sterling, king of the Lycan sovereign territory. A guttural, animalistic sound of pure, unadulterated madness tore from Liam's throat. His entire illusion of control shattered into jagged pieces as the reality of what he had thrown away crashed down on him. Aela, Liam roared, stepping frantically into the aisle, his voice cracking with a possessive, deranged desperation. "No, you are mine. You cannot do this. Silence," Gerald commanded. He did not yell. He did not bare his fangs. The word simply dropped from lips with the crushing weight of an avalanche, carrying a sovereign pressure so absolute that Liam's knees instantly buckled. The arrogant alpha hit the obsidian floor with a heavy thud, unable to take another step against the sheer, oppressive gravity of Gerald's aura. Clara stumbled back with a terrified gasp, shrinking against the stone pillars as the air in the temple grew violently heavy. Gerald turned his focus entirely back to his mate, completely dismissing the trembling alpha crawling on the floor behind them. He reached out, his large, calloused hands gently enveloping Aela's. The physical contact sent a massive visible ripple of static electricity through the air, causing the flames of the floating candles to flare violently and shift to a brilliant, burning gold. We stand before the goddess, in the neutral light of the ancient sanctuary, to witness the merging of two sovereign souls. Priest Oris projected, his voice carrying effortlessly over the howling wind and Liam's desperate gasping. This is not a bond of convenience. This is not a union of politics. This is the sacred, cosmic alignment of fated equals. Aela did not look back at Liam. Her silver eyes remained locked entirely on Gerald. "I, Gerald Sterling, sovereign of the Eastern Empire, claim you, Aela Ashwood, as my true, fated mate," he vowed, his deep, gravelly voice trembling slightly with the sheer, overwhelming magnitude of his emotion. "I offer you my crown, my armies, and my absolute, unyielding loyalty. I will stand beside you in the light. I will shield you in the dark, and I will burn the world to ash before I ever let you walk alone." The sincerity in his vows struck Aela like a physical blow to the chest, shattering the very last remnants of her guarded defenses. The contrast between this magnificent, terrifying king offering her the world and Liam Vance sobbing uselessly at the back of the temple was a poetic, vindicating justice that healed her on a cellular level. "I, Aela Ashwood, accept your claim," she responded, her voice clear, melodious, and perfectly audible to the ruined man struggling on the floor. She stepped up onto the final tier of the altar, bringing them perfectly eye to eye. "I offer you my strength, my magic, and my unbroken soul. I claim you, Gerald Sterling, as my true, fated mate, now and until the stars fall from the sky." The moment the final syllable left her lips, the high marriage rites were sealed. The reaction was instantaneous and apocalyptic. The fated bond between them flared with an astronomical, terrifying surge of supreme elemental power. The crescent mark on Aela's left wrist erupted into blinding, molten golden fire. The light did not just stay on her skin. It burst outward, an explosive shockwave of radiant, pure solar energy that swept through the grand temple. The violent ignition of the new golden bond actively hunted down the microscopic, dying thread of Liam's toxic connection and utterly vaporized it. From the back of the sanctuary, Liam screamed. It was not a cry of emotional defeat. It was the agonizing, horrific shriek of a man having his very soul ripped out of his chest. The severed bond struck him with unimaginable somatic pain, and he collapsed fully onto the polished obsidian floor, writhing in complete, broken agony as the golden light washed over him. At the altar, Gerald pulled Aela against his chest, wrapping his strong arms around her waist, and crushed his mouth to hers. The kiss was a collision of fire and gravity, an urgent, desperate claiming that sealed the vows in flesh and magic. Aela tangled her fingers into the thick, dark hair at the nape of his neck, kissing him back with a fierce, awakened passion. The golden fire of their bond swirled around them, an impenetrable, sacred shield that formally announced the birth of a new High Queen. As they broke the kiss, breathing heavily, their foreheads resting against one another in the blinding golden light, Aella felt a profound, supreme sense of arrival. She was no longer a discarded secret. She was Aella Ashwood, queen of this vast empire, and she would never, ever look back. The blinding golden light that had erupted through the sanctuary slowly began to recede, drawing back into the very skin of the newly bonded couple, like liquid fire retreating to its hearth. It left behind an atmosphere completely saturated with ancient, thrumming magic, a cosmic pressure that tasted like summer storms and melted honey. As the divine radiance faded from the vaulted ceilings, the heavy echoing silence of the grand temple returned, broken only by a wretched, wet gasping from the floor. Aella Ashwood remained on the highest tier of the crescent-shaped altar, her chest rising and falling in a steady, euphoric rhythm. The agonizing, bruising ache that had plagued her ribs for hours, a direct result of her previous mate's brutal betrayal, was completely gone. It was as if a heavy, rusted iron cage had finally been lifted from her chest, allowing her to breathe freely for the very first time. In its place, the molten gold bond crest on her left wrist pulsed with a comforting, radiant heat, syncing perfectly with the booming heartbeat of the massive sovereign positioned beside her. She turned her gaze downward, looking past the protective, broad shoulder of Gerald Sterling. At the base of the obsidian steps, Alpha Liam Vance was violently coming apart. The sudden, apocalyptic severing of their original fated tether had not been a quiet psychological shift. It was a literal, spiritual amputation. The violent ignition of the Lycan King's royal claim had actively hunted down the microscopic, toxic thread Liam had tried to stretch across the neutral borders, cauterizing it with divine fire. It burned through the ancestral pathways of his soul, tearing away every lingering claim he had ever held over her, leaving nothing but an agonizing, scorched emptiness. Now, the arrogant leader of the Thornwood Pack was curled into a pathetic, trembling ball on the polished black stone. His physical body was completely rejecting the sudden emptiness inside him. Liam's broad shoulders shook with violent, uncontrollable tremors, his expensive velvet wedding coat bunching up around his neck. The fated mate bond was designed by the moon goddess to be a vital organ of the soul, a delicate network of magic and emotion. By rejecting Aella for political convenience, he had poisoned it. By witnessing her bond with another, he had completely destroyed it. The phantom sensation of a gaping, freezing crater in his chest caused him to claw desperately at his own sternum. His fingernails left deep, bloody scratches across his throat as his lungs fought for air that simply was not there. His mind completely fracturing under the immense pressure of his own arrogance. The exact agonizing cold that Aella had suffered while walking through the deadly winter blizzard was now flooding Liam's veins. He gasped for breath, his lungs feeling as though they were filled with crushed ice and jagged glass. His teeth chattered violently, a sickly, pale pallor overtaking his authoritative complexion. The claiming mark he had proudly borne on his own collarbone was actively burning away. The skin blistered and hissed, the residual magic turning to black ash, leaving behind nothing but a deep, ugly, hollow scar where his destiny had once been written. Slowly, fighting through the blinding waves of somatic agony, Liam forced his head up. His storm-grey eyes were completely bloodshot, wide with an unhinged, spiraling madness as he stared up at the high altar. He expected to see a tear in the fabric of reality. He expected to see the universe forcefully correct itself, bringing the dirt-smudged, quiet servant girl crawling back to his boots. Instead, it became the moment Liam Vance's entire world shattered into irreparable, jagged pieces. Positioned above him was not a defeated outcast. Hovering above him was a supreme deity of the ancient world. Aella was draped in the impossibly heavy royal crimson and gold silks, the fabric catching the flickering light of 1,000 enchanted candles. The thick silver-tipped fur mantle rested majestically upon her shoulders, framing a face that held absolutely no trace of the tears he had expected to cause. The ancestral royal circlet sat perfectly in her dark hair, its sunburst fire rubies glowing with a fierce incandescent power that physically blinded him. She was a queen. She was the most magnificent, untouchable creature he had ever seen, and he had thrown her away for a few carts of wintergrain and a meaningless political treaty. No, Liam whimpered, the sound tearing through his shredded vocal cords. It was a guttural, animalistic noise, completely devoid of the commanding alpha timbre he used to terrorize his pack. No, Aila. This is a mistake. This is a trick of the light. He tried to push himself up off the obsidian floor, his limbs shaking violently under the crushing weight of his severed bond. I brought it, Liam babbled, his voice cracking with a possessive, deranged desperation. He clumsily shoved his trembling, bruised hand into the pocket of his tailored coat. His fingers dug frantically against the lining until he pulled out the very object that had triggered her departure in the first place. He held it up toward the towering altar. It was the rusted iron ring. He had gone back to the council chamber floor, picked up the cheap, flaking band of base metal, and brought it to the temple. He had fully intended to force it upon her hand in secret before marrying his wealthy bride. He held up a piece of decaying garbage to a woman wearing the stars themselves, completely unable to process the absolute disparity between his offering and her current reality. I was going to give it to you, the broken man sobbed. His storm-grey eyes darted wildly between Aila and the terrifying sovereign anchored beside her. I did this for us, Aila. I did it for the pack. You are my fated mate. You cannot wear his gold. You have to wear the iron. You promised to heal me. You promised. He began to drag his heavy body forward, his fingernails scraping a terrible, high-pitched sound against the polished stone as he tried to crawl up the first step of the altar. Before Aela could even formulate a response to the breathtaking audacity of his delusion, the air pressure inside the Grand Temple dropped to a lethal, suffocating level. Gerald Sterling moved. The Lycan King did not rush, nor did he display the frantic, chaotic energy of the ruined Alpha on the floor. He stepped smoothly in front of Aela, placing his massive, armored presence squarely between his queen and the creeping threat. The moment Gerald planted his boots on the edge of the altar, a visible shockwave of sovereign pressure blasted outward. The ambient temperature around the high altar skyrocketed, fueled by the ancient, protective instincts of a sovereign defending his chosen mate. It was a physical, crushing wall of gravity. The invisible force struck Liam squarely in the chest, lifting his heavy frame off the steps and throwing him violently backward. The Alpha crashed onto the sanctuary floor, skidding across the obsidian until his back slammed brutally against the base of a towering stone pillar. The rusted iron ring flew from his grasp, bouncing pathetically across the floor before disappearing into the dark shadows of the eastern wing. "You will not approach the altar," Gerald rumbled. His deep, gravelly voice did not need to be raised to dominate the vast space. It vibrated through the ancient stones, carrying a lethal, absolute promise of violence. "You will not raise your voice in this sanctuary, and you will never, under penalty of immediate death, speak her name again." Liam choked, clutching his throat as the sheer weight of Gerald's aura pinned him to the floor. He could not breathe. He could not move. He was a small, insignificant insect caught beneath the boot of a true apex predator. The Lycan King's molten gold eyes burned with a terrifying predatory intelligence, projecting a protective fury that made the floating candles above them flicker wildly in the sudden draft. "She is mine," Liam gasped out, spitting a mouthful of blood onto the pristine floor. His madness refused to let him submit, his mind clinging desperately to the past. "She is a Thornwood Omega. She belongs in my shadow." "She belongs to no one but herself," Gerald countered softly, his tone shifting into a chilling, calm register that terrified the onlooking temple monks far more than a roar. He reached back, gently wrapping his large, warm hand around Aela's, weaving their fingers together. The simple, intimate gesture caused another brilliant flash of solar heat to pulse from the molten gold bond crest. You did not cast out an Omega. You cast out the High Queen of the Eastern Lycan Empire. You looked at the divine design of the goddess and tried to negotiate a better price. You are not a leader, Liam Vance. You are a merchant who went bankrupt buying his own ruin. At the back of the temple, shrinking against the heavy iron doors, Clara Danvers watched the entire horrific spectacle unfold. The calculating heiress was draped in her exquisite white wedding gown, the delicate lace shivering violently against her skin. The heavy, cloying scent of sweet gardenia that usually followed her had turned entirely sour, reeking of sudden, primal fear. Clara had manipulated the political landscape of the Northern Territories for years, wanting the absolute power of a thriving pack and the unmatched security of an invincible alpha. But as she looked at the pathetic, weeping creature pinned to the floor by the Lycan King's mere presence, a cold, clinical realization washed over her. A mate-severed alpha was a cursed liability. Without the stabilizing magic of a fated bond, Liam's mind would continue to fracture, and his pack would instantly lose respect for him. Clara stared at the bloody scratches on Liam's neck, the absolute ruin of his once proud posture, and she felt nothing but profound, visceral disgust. This was not the mighty alpha she had bargained for. This was a broken, weeping shell of a man who had foolishly discarded his most valuable asset. She realized instantly that tying her wealthy bloodline to a cursed, broken madman who had just earned the lethal enmity of the Lycan King would mean the complete eradication of her family's empire. The political alliance was dead. Liam caught the movement out of the corner of his bloodshot eyes. He turned his head, reaching a trembling, desperate hand toward his intended bride. "Clara," he rasped, his voice a pathetic, wheezing plea. "Clara, help me up. Explain it to the elders. Speak of the grain. Remind them about the treaty." Clara looked down at him, her beautiful features twisting into a mask of pure, unadulterated contempt. "You are a broken vessel, Liam," she whispered, her voice carrying a cold, venomous clarity across the silent hall. "You have no magic, you have no dignity, you have nothing left to offer me." She did not wait for his response. Gathering the heavy skirts of her white gown, the heiress turned her back on the ruined alpha. She slipped through the narrow gap in the massive iron doors, disappearing into the howling winter blizzard without a single backward glance, leaving Liam completely and utterly isolated in the freezing void of his own making. A fresh, agonizing sob tore from Liam's throat as the reality of his total abandonment finally set in. He had traded his fated mate for an alliance, and the alliance had just walked out the door, leaving him with absolutely nothing. He turned his desperate, weeping face back toward the high altar, his storm-grey eyes searching the shadows for a shred of the unconditional mercy Aela had always provided him. Aela Ashwood stepped out from behind the protective, massive frame of her king. She halted at the very edge of the crescent-shaped altar, looking down at the man who had commanded her to scrub his floors and hide in the dark. The heavy crimson and gold silks swirled around her ankles, projecting an aura of absolute, untouchable majesty. The fire rubies in her crown seemed to pulse with the rhythmic, steady beating of her new, perfect bond. She looked at Liam's bleeding throat. She felt the hollow, freezing echo of his severed magic crying out for healing. For 3 years, her immediate instinct had always been to drop to her knees, to summon her dormant warmth, and to stitch his wounds back together at the cost of her own energy. She had bled for him. She had starved for him. She had made herself small so he could feel tall, but as she stared at his pathetic, writhing form, Aela felt absolutely nothing. The well of her infinite patience had run completely dry. The glacial ice that had formed in her chest back in the council chamber had not melted to make room for pity. It had been permanently replaced by the radiant, sovereign fire of her true lineage. You claim that I had nowhere to go, Aela said, her voice clear, melodious, and echoing with the terrifying, beautiful resonance of the ancient tongue. She did not yell. The absolute stillness of her tone cut deeper than any scream of rage ever could. You insisted that the winter beyond the borders was a death sentence, and that I could not survive without your protection. Liam whimpered, pressing his face against the cold obsidian floor, unable to bear the blinding, radiant light pouring from her celestial marks. You thought my silence was submission, Aela continued, her silver eyes completely devoid of mercy. You thought that, because I did not weep, because I did not beg you to change your mind, I was weak. You thought you could cage the sun in a servant's wing and feed it rusted iron. She raised her left hand, pushing back the heavy crimson sleeve to expose her wrist. The molten gold bond crest flared brilliantly, illuminating the entire sanctuary with a warm, restorative light that actively repelled the freezing shadows clinging to Liam's broken body. The hollow mark doesn't just contain your power, it creates a void, an absence where your magic should be, Aela recited quietly, throwing the agonizing truth of his betrayal back at him. You tried to force me into that void, but smallness is a gift. It taught me how to observe. It taught me how to survive the freezing cold you built around me. And most importantly, it taught me exactly what I am worth. She lowered her hand, her posture perfectly straight, carrying the weight of the ancestral crown without a single tremor of doubt. I am Aela Ashwood, Queen of the Lycan sovereign territory, she declared, the finality of her words sealing the cosmic judgment against him. And you are nothing but a fading footnote in my story. I leave you to the cold, Alpha Liam. May it grant you the exact amount of mercy you showed me. Priest Orus, waiting silently in the shadows of the altar, raised his glowing moonstone staff and brought it down hard against the stone floor. The sharp, cracking echo signaled the absolute conclusion of the high marriage rites. The temple monks immediately resumed a low, harmonious hum, their voices weaving a protective ward of sound that effectively drowned out Liam's desperate, spiraling weeping. Gerald turned to his queen, the terrifying, lethal edge of his aura instantly vanishing the moment his golden eyes met hers. He did not ask if she was all right. He did not offer empty platitudes. He simply reached out, gently cupping the side of her face with his large, calloused hand. The immediate, grounding scent of amber and cedar washed over her, a rich, woody warmth that anchored her racing heart. The gentleness of the dreaded beast, reserved entirely and exclusively for her, was the most profound validation Aela had ever experienced. "It is time to go home, my queen," Gerald murmured, his deep voice wrapping around her like a warm, heavy blanket. "Yes," Aela whispered, offering him a brilliant, breathtaking smile that made the sovereign's breath catch in his throat. "Take me home." The Lycan king offered her his arm. Aela placed her hand securely in the crook of his elbow, the physical contact generating a steady, thrumming current of pure solar warmth between them. Together, they turned away from the high altar, moving with a synchronized, fluid grace that spoke of an ancient, perfectly balanced partnership. They walked slowly down the long, candlelit aisle, the heavy crimson and gold silks trailing majestically over the polished obsidian. She did not hate him. She did not pity him. She simply felt nothing at all. They did not look down as they passed the broken, shivering mass of the Thornwood Alpha. They stepped around Liam Vance as if he were nothing more than a piece of discarded debris on the sanctuary floor. As the towering iron doors of the Grand Temple were pulled open by the royal guards, revealing the waiting carriages and the fiercely loyal Lycan army beyond, Aela stepped out into the freezing winter night. The blizzard still raged violently across the mountain peaks, the wind howling with deadly force. But for the first time in her entire life, Aela Ashwood did not feel the cold. Shielded by the massive presence of the king beside her, and fueled by the blazing, awakened fire of her own divine soul, she walked forward into the blinding light of her new empire, leaving the rusted shadows permanently behind. The heavy iron doors of the grand temple stood partially open, their massive hinges groaning as the brutal winter wind swept across the polished obsidian floor. The sanctuary, once filled with the blinding, divine radiance of Ayla's royal ascension, was now swallowed by a suffocating, freezing darkness. At the base of the crescent-shaped altar, Alpha Liam Vance lay exactly where he had fallen. He was completely alone. The temple monks had retreated into the eastern wing, refusing to offer even a single glance of pity to a man who had actively poisoned the sacred design of the moon goddess by treating his fated mate as a secondary, disposable asset. Liam's physical body was a broken, shivering ruin. The violent severing of his fated mate bond was not a temporary wound. It was a permanent, spiritual amputation that left a gaping necrotic void in his chest. Every time he attempted to draw a breath, his lungs burned, as if he were inhaling crushed glass and glacial ice. The claiming mark on his collarbone, which had once tied his soul to Ayla's radiant warmth, was now a hollow, blackened scar. It blistered and wept, the residual magic turning to ash against his pale skin. The constant, agonizing throb of the severed tether was a somatic nightmare, a literal rotting of his internal magic that he would have to endure for the rest of his miserable life. With a guttural, wheezing sob, Liam forced his heavy, uncoordinated limbs to move. He dragged his trembling frame across the smooth stone, his expensive velvet coat tearing against the sharp edges of the temple stairs. He crawled toward the massive threshold, his bloodshot eyes staring desperately out into the raging blizzard. He needed to find Clara. He needed to salvage the political alliance. The Thornwood pack was entirely dependent on her wealth, and if she left him now, his people would starve before the spring thaw. He reached the top of the ice-coated granite staircase, just as the storm broke for a brief, cruel moment, revealing the frozen valley below. At the base of the mountain pass, a massive convoy of heavy wooden wagons was coming to a halt. Clara Danvers sat inside her luxurious, heated carriage, the plush velvet curtains drawn back just enough for her to survey the disaster. She was no longer trembling in her delicate white wedding gown. The calculating heiress had wrapped herself in a thick bearskin cloak, her beautiful features set into a mask of pure clinical pragmatism. She looked up toward the grand temple, her sharp eyes catching the pathetic, crawling silhouette of the ruined Alpha at the top of the stairs. There was no affection in her gaze, no lingering attachment to the man she had planned to make her king. To Clara, a mate-severed Alpha was not a tragic figure. He was a toxic liability. Without the stabilizing magic of a true Luna, Liam's mind would inevitably fracture into violent madness, and his pack would descend into chaotic rebellion, tying her immense wealth to a crumbling empire, and a man who had just earned the lethal enmity of the Lycan King was an act of financial suicide. She did not operate on emotion. She operated on leverage, and Liam Vance had just lost all of his. "Turn the wagons around," Clara commanded, her voice carrying a cold, venomous clarity that cut through the howling wind. She addressed her captain of the guard, a massive, scarred warrior who immediately bowed his head in obedience. "The treaty is void. We are not leaving a single ounce of grain or a single blade of steel in this cursed territory. We return to the north immediately." "Clara!" Liam shrieked, the sound tearing through his shredded vocal cords. It was a pathetic, desperate wail that echoed weakly down the mountainside, completely devoid of his former commanding alpha timbre. "Clara, wait! The Alliance! We had a deal! You promised!" Down in the valley, the heiress did not even blink. She let the heavy velvet curtain fall shut, completely obscuring her face from his view. The captain shouted an order, and the massive draft horses began to pivot in the deep snow. Liam watched in absolute, paralyzing horror as the long line of heavily laden wagons, the grain that was supposed to feed his starving people, the steel that was supposed to fortify his borders, the exact resources he had traded his soul for, began to roll away. They vanished into the swirling white vortex of the blizzard, taking the very last shred of his political future with them. He collapsed onto the freezing stone, burying his face in his bloody, bruised hands. He had traded a goddess for a merchant's caravan, and the caravan had simply turned around and left him bankrupt. The crunch of heavy boots on the icy steps forced him to look up. Emerging from the snowy tree line were the elite elders of the Thornwood pack. They had followed Liam to the neutral borders to officially witness the political union, expecting to return to the capital with Clara's vast dowry. Instead, they found their alpha crawling in the snow, coughing up blood, entirely abandoned by his wealthy bride. The lead elder, a grizzled veteran with a scarred jaw, stared down at the pathetic creature before him. He looked at the black, necrotic scar on Liam's neck. He smelled the putrid, rotting scent of a permanently severed fated bond. The elder's eyes narrowed, filling with the exact same disgust and impatience he had shown Ayala back in the council chamber. "The heiress is gone," the elder stated flatly, his voice devoid of any respect or sympathy. "She took the grain, she took the steel. The winter will decimate us, and you have absolutely nothing left to offer this pack to save it." "Help me," Liam wheezed, reaching a trembling hand toward the men he had once commanded. "I am your alpha. Get me to a healer." The pain, the cold, the elder did not reach out to help him. Instead, he took a deliberate step backward, physically distancing himself from the cursed liability on the ground. "You are no longer an alpha, Liam Vance. You are a broken vessel who sold our honor for a lie, and lost both. You are stripped of your title, your lands, and your name." The elders turned their backs in unison, marching away into the freezing storm, leaving him completely and utterly isolated in the brutal wilderness. As the snow began to rapidly bury his shivering form, Liam Vance squeezed his eyes shut, a fresh, agonizing sob tearing from his chest. The phantom sensation of Ayala's radiant, healing warmth flickered mockingly in the back of his mind. A beautiful, untouchable memory of the absolute devotion he had thrown away, and a torturous reminder of the freezing, permanent ruin he would now suffer forever. The harsh, biting winter of the neutral borderlands was a distant, fading memory. 6 months had passed, and within the protective, enchanted walls of the royal domain, the world had transformed into a vibrant, breathtaking tapestry of early summer. The sprawling palace gardens of the royal capital were fully in bloom, exploding with rich, saturated colors and the intoxicating scents of crushed jasmine, wild honey, and sun-warmed cedar. The air was not thick with the desperate, suffocating tension of political survival, but with the quiet, profound peace of absolute sanctuary. Ayala Ashwood stood before the massive, arched glass doors of her private chambers, looking out over the flourishing kingdom. She was no longer the exhausted, invisible Omega who had scrubbed cold granite floors in rough, untreated wool, draped in a stunning, lightweight gown of pure white silk interwoven with delicate threads of molten gold. She radiated an aura of uncompromised, supreme majesty. The physical transformation was staggering. The hollow, bruised exhaustion that had once haunted her silver eyes had been entirely replaced by a sharp, piercing clarity. The golden bond crest resting upon her left wrist pulsed with a steady, rhythmic heat, a flawless, perfectly sealed somatic connection that fed her soul with continuous, restorative light. Today was the day of her formal sovereign coronation. The high marriage rites at the temple had bound her soul to the king, but today, before the entire Lycan court and the assembled armies of the empire, she would officially receive the sovereign's gleaming coronet, establishing her lifelong supportive union not just as a mate, but as an equal ruler. A heavy, familiar warmth settled directly behind her, cutting through her quiet introspection. Ayala did not need to turn around to know who had entered the room. The ambient temperature shifted instantly, enveloped by the deep, grounding scent of amber and cedar. Gerald Sterling wrapped his massive, muscular arms around her waist, pulling her gently back against his broad chest. The sheer, terrifying magnitude of the Lycan King was well known across 3 continents. He was an apex predator who could shatter armies with a single command. Yet, in the quiet intimacy of their chambers, he was exceptionally, almost agonizingly gentle. He buried his face in the crook of her neck, inhaling her sweet, celestial scent with a deep, rumbling sigh of absolute contentment. "You are trembling, my queen," Gerald murmured, his deep, gravelly voice vibrating pleasantly against her spine. It was not a command or an observation of weakness, but a statement of protective devotion. "I am not afraid," Aella whispered, leaning back into his solid warmth, letting his steady heartbeat anchor her racing pulse. "I am simply overwhelmed for so long. I believed that my smallness was my only defense. I believed that to be seen was to be in danger now. I am about to step onto a balcony and be seen by an entire empire." Gerald slowly turned her around to face him. He was dressed in impeccable, dark ceremonial armor, the polished obsidian plates gleaming in the morning sunlight. His piercing, molten gold eyes held an intense, unwavering focus that instantly silenced any lingering echoes of her past insecurities. "A girl who has never been seen cannot be replaced because she was never there to begin with," he said softly, repeating the silent realization she had once harbored in her darkest hour. He raised his large, calloused hands, gently cupping her face. "But you are here, Aella. You are the beating heart of this territory. You do not need to make yourself small ever again. The world will simply have to make itself larger to accommodate you." His words struck a deep, resonant chord within her chest, completely obliterating the final microscopic shards of glacial ice Liam had left behind. She offered him a brilliant, breathtaking smile, the radiant solar fire of her divine lineage briefly illuminating the room with a warm, golden flash. Gerald leaned down and pressed a slow, reverent kiss to her forehead, a quiet promise of the lifelong partnership they were about to formalize before the realm. Together, their fingers seamlessly intertwined, the king and queen walked out of the sunlit chambers and moved toward the grand balcony overlooking the capital. The moment they stepped into the open air, a deafening, thunderous roar erupted from the valley below. Thousands of Lycans, fierce warriors, pack elders, and citizens from every corner of the vast empire were gathered in the sprawling courtyard. They were not there to demand her subservience or to judge her worth based on political alliances or grain shipments. They were there to honor the celestial prophecy that had finally returned to their lands. Gerald raised his free hand, and the massive crowd instantly fell into a heavy, respectful silence. He did not address them with the arrogant, demanding sneer of a merchant trying to secure a trade. He spoke with the absolute, unquestionable authority of a sovereign who had found his true equal. For centuries, our lands have been defined by cold steel and solitary strength. Gerald's voice boomed across the silent courtyard, echoing off the ancient stone walls. But true power is not built in the freezing shadows of isolation. It is forged in the radiant light of a genuine, equal bond. Before the goddess and before this empire, I do not present a Luna who will stand beneath me. I present a Aella Ashwood, the supreme vessel of the sun-born lineage, the High Queen who will rule forever beside me. Priest Oris, who had travelled from the neutral border specifically for this ceremony, stepped forward from the shadows of the balcony. He carried the heavy ancestral crown of crimson and gold upon a velvet cushion. Priest Oris took the magnificent headpiece, the sunburst fire rubies glowing brightly in the summer sun. With a look of profound shaking reverence, the venerable priest lowered the crown and placed it perfectly upon Aella's head. The physical response of the earth was instantaneous. As the cold metal settled against her skin, the dormant cosmic magic within Aella fully awakened. It did not erupt in a violent, destructive shockwave. Instead, it radiated outward in a massive, gentle wave of liquid golden warmth. The physical energy swept over the palace gardens and down into the valley, sinking deep into the soil. The crowd gasped in awe as the flora around the capital responded to her divine presence. Ancient vines bloomed with sudden, vibrant crimson flowers, and the chill of the distant mountains was pushed back by an impenetrable shield of eternal summer. Aela looked down at the faces of her new people, her chest swelling with a fierce, protective love that she no longer had to hide. She had survived the freezing betrayal. She had rebuilt her soul in exile, and she had returned not just to survive, but to conquer and heal. Hours later, as the elaborate coronation festivities continued in the grand halls below, Aela and Gerald slipped away from the noise, retreating to the quiet, private sanctuary of the inner gardens. The moonlight filtered through the canopy of ancient cedar trees, casting silver and gold shadows across the stone pathways. Gerald led her to a carved marble bench near a trickling fountain. Before she could sit, the massive king dropped to one knee on the soft grass before her. It was not a posture of defeat, but a voluntary, physical surrender of his immense power to the woman who held his soul. He wrapped his arms around her waist, pressing his face against her stomach, listening to the steady, strong rhythm of her life. Aela ran her fingers through his dark hair, her touch slow and grounding. The molten gold crest on her wrist hummed a quiet, satisfied tune against his skin. The terrifying beast who had conquered kingdoms was completely at peace, gentled by the unconditional, safe shelter she provided. Find someone who makes you want to build a better world. Gerald murmured against her skin, his breath warm through the thin silk of her gown. He looked up at her, his golden eyes reflecting the stars above. And for the first time in my life, I look forward to the morning. We will build it together, Aela whispered, her heart completely full, the shadows of the past permanently erased, because the biggest forces in this world can only break it apart. But small, silent acts of love, they are what mend it. With the kingdom thriving under her gentle fire and the unwavering protection of her king, Aela lived in the mended world, a supreme sovereign who had walked through the freezing dark to claim her undeniable right to the dawn.